Thousands of Australian families have the same story. Different names, different details, same bitter punchline. A grandfather who served at Darwin, ground crew usually, sometimes a pilot. He'd be halfway through his beer at the RSL, staring at nothing, and he'd start talking about a bloke named Tommy, or Bill, or whatever name stuck in his memory for 60 years. Tommy came back from a sortie white as a sheet, slammed his fist against the fuselage so hard the ground crew thought he'd broken his hand. The guns hadn't fired. Not a single round. The cannons had jammed. Again. The ground crew had stripped them, cleaned them, reassembled them 3 times that week. Didn't matter. Tommy had watched a Japanese bomber fly right through his gun sight, finger pressed hard on the trigger, hearing nothing but the wind and his own heartbeat. These stories echo across Australia. Kitchen table memories, half-finished sentences about equipment that didn't work, and a war that made no sense. Fragments passed down through families who never got the full picture, because the full picture was deliberately hidden from them. For decades, these fragments seemed like old men's grumbling, complaints that didn't match what everyone knew about the Spitfire, the aircraft that saved Britain, the legend. But the veterans weren't wrong. The legend was. The Spitfire's Darwin failure wasn't about aircraft quality. It was fuel range, jamming cannons, and a doctrine designed for a different war entirely. And this truth was revealed most clearly not by technical analysis, but by the stories veterans told their families. Stories that never made it into official history. Stories that were actively suppressed from Australian public memory for reasons that had nothing to do with military security and everything to do with protecting a myth. We lost more Spitfires running out of fuel than in fights. Let that contradiction sit with you. Because once you understand it, you understand everything wrong with how this war was fought, and why the veterans in your family couldn't explain what happened to them. Before we talk about the Spitfire, you need to understand what Darwin had already survived, and what Australians were deliberately never told about it. February 19th, 1942. Just after 10 in the morning. The first Japanese raid hit Darwin with 188 aircraft, more planes than attacked Pearl Harbor. 4 waves of bombers and fighters turned the town into an inferno. Bombs fell on the harbor, the airfield, the town centre. Ships burned at their moorings. Oil storage tanks exploded and sent black smoke thousands of feet into the sky. The post office took a direct hit, with people still inside. At least 235 people died that day. The actual number was probably higher. The chaos was so complete that bodies were never recovered, records were never finalised, and the military counted differently than civilian authorities. The Australian government told the public 17 died. 17. This wasn't confusion in the fog of war. This was deliberate suppression ordered from the highest levels. Cabinet records show the discussion. Singapore had fallen 4 days earlier. The Japanese were advancing through the Pacific with terrifying speed. Australia genuinely feared invasion, not as paranoia, but as strategic probability, based on actual Japanese military capabilities and apparent intentions. The government calculated that panic would cripple war production, that accurate reporting would break civilian morale at the precise moment morale needed to be steel, that Australians couldn't handle the truth about what had happened to their own country. So they lied. And that lie became the template for everything that followed. The newspapers of February 20th, 1942 reported the raid in terms so sanitized they bordered on fiction. Headlines emphasized the military nature of the targets. Casualty figures were suppressed or minimized. The scale of destruction was systematically underreported. Sensors ensured that photographs showing the true extent of damage never reached the Australian public. Darwin would be bombed 64 times between February 1942 and November 1943. 64 separate raids. Most Australians today can't name a single one beyond the first. That's not accident or ignorance. That's narrative management that persisted for decades after any legitimate security justification had expired. The P-40 Kitty Hawks of 77 Squadron were defending Darwin through 1942. They weren't glamorous aircraft. American-built, designed for export, considered second-rate by pilots who'd flown Spitfires or Hurricanes in the European theatre. Aviation magazines dismissed them. Allied propaganda barely mentioned them. But they worked. In the dust and heat of the Northern Territory, against Japanese raiders flying from Timor, the P-40s did what they were supposed to do. Their guns fired when pilots pressed the trigger. Their fuel tanks held enough to complete missions. Their rugged construction survived rough landings on packed dirt strips. And then Prime Minister John Curtin begged Winston Churchill for something better. The communications between Curtin and Churchill tell their own story. Curtin wanted Spitfires, specifically Spitfires, the aircraft that stopped Hitler, the legend that had captured the world's imagination during the Battle of Britain. Curtin understood the propaganda value. Australia needed to believe it was being defended by the best. The Australian public needed to see that Britain, the mother country, was sending its finest. Churchill eventually agreed, partly from genuine alliance solidarity, partly because sending Spitfires to Australia served British propaganda purposes in ways that helped Churchill's own political position. The message was clear to the world. Britain stands with Australia. Britain sends its best. The empire endures. Nobody asked the men who'd actually been fighting whether they wanted their reliable P-40s replaced. January 17, 1943. Number 1 Fighter Wing arrives in Darwin. 3 squadrons. 452 Squadron, RAAF, 457 Squadron, RAAF, and 54 Squadron, RAF. Spitfire Mark Vs, the aircraft that broke the Luftwaffe over Britain. Prime Minister Curtin made a public announcement on March 4th that Spitfires were operational in Australia. Newspapers celebrated across the country. The cavalry had arrived. The legend had come to save them. Leading the wing was Wing Commander Clive "Killer" Caldwell, Australia's top ace. 20.5 confirmed victories over North Africa, flying against German pilots in Messerschmitts, the best the Luftwaffe had. Caldwell had earned his kills through skill, aggression, and an absolute clarity about what worked in aerial combat. If anyone could make the Spitfire work in the Pacific, it was Caldwell. Within weeks, he was writing furious reports about an aircraft that seemed designed to fail in every way that mattered. The Hispano 20mm cannon looked devastating on paper. Explosive shells capable of tearing apart bomber airframes. Theoretical muzzle velocity of 840 meters per second. Rate of fire around 600 rounds per minute. A few solid hits could do what dozens of machine gun rounds couldn't. The mathematics of destruction were compelling. On specification sheets in London, the Hispano was exactly what Darwin needed. Theoretical. That word became the darkest joke at Darwin. Ground crews would say it with hollow laughs after another pilot came back with guns that hadn't fired. Theoretical muzzle velocity of 840 meters per second. Actual muzzle velocity of 0, because the gun was jammed. Understanding why the Hispano failed requires understanding how it worked, and how Darwin's conditions attacked every assumption its designers had made. The Hispano used a belt-fed mechanism that required precise tolerances. The ammunition belt had to feed smoothly through a series of guides. Each round had to chamber at exactly the right angle, at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right pressure. In the controlled conditions of English factories and English airfields, this worked beautifully. The problem started with the ammunition itself. Brass cartridges expand in humidity. Not much, fractions of a millimetre. But the Hispano's feed mechanism had been machined to tolerances that assumed English weather. Fractions of a millimetre meant the difference between a round chambering smoothly and a round jamming halfway into the breech. Darwin's wet season brought humidity levels that English engineers had never imagined when they designed the weapon. 80%, 90%. Air so thick with moisture that brass swelled measurably within hours of being loaded. The dry season brought different problems. Dust. Fine red particles that infiltrated everything, worked their way into feed mechanisms, fouled lubricants, accumulated on surfaces that needed to stay mirror smooth. The dust of the Northern Territory was not like English dust. It was abrasive, persistent. It found ways into sealed compartments. And then there was the heat. Components that held their shape perfectly in English weather warped under tropical sun. Springs lost tension. Timing mechanisms drifted out of specification. Metal expanded at different rates in different parts of the mechanism, throwing alignments off by fractions of millimeters that made all the difference. The gun became a suggestion rather than a weapon. March 2nd, 1943. First major engagement with Japanese raiders over Darwin. Caldwell himself, Australia's greatest ace, the man they called Killer, dove on enemy aircraft. He had a 0 in his sights. Perfect angle, perfect range. One cannon working. One. He was credited with 2 zeros anyway, because Caldwell was Caldwell. Skill compensated for equipment failure, but the chronic problem infected the entire wing. Flight Lieutenant Ross Stagg reported the same failures. Pilots across all 3 squadrons dove on enemy aircraft, lined up shots that should have been kills, pressed the trigger, heard nothing. The sound of a Hispano jamming became the sound of Darwin. That distinctive click silence that meant your weapon had betrayed you at the moment you needed it most. The ground crews worked themselves past exhaustion, trying to solve an unsolvable problem. These were skilled men, armourers who'd trained specifically for this work, who understood the Hispano's mechanisms intimately, who took professional pride in keeping aircraft operational. They developed routines that became rituals. Strip the cannons completely. Clean every surface with whatever solvents they could find or manufacture. Inspect each component for wear or damage under inadequate lighting. Reassemble with meticulous attention to specification. Test fire on the ground. Declare operational. Pilot takes off. Pilot returns with jammed guns. Repeat. The armourer who cleaned that cannon 3 times in one day wasn't careless. The fitter who reassembled it perfectly wasn't negligent. They were fighting physics. A weapon designed for English drizzle forced to work in tropical hell. Every successful repair was temporary. Every declaration of operational was provisional. The bitter joke about theoretical muzzle velocity spread through the squadrons because dark humour was the only response available. 840 metres per second on the spec sheet. 0 in combat. The men who maintained those aircraft knew the truth before any official report was written. The Hispano 20mm was fundamentally unsuitable for these conditions. No amount of effort, no level of skill, no degree of dedication could change that fundamental fact. But here's what the official reports didn't emphasize. The .50 caliber Browning machine guns, the American weapons fitted to the P-40s, worked. Every time. in the same humidity, in the same dust, under the same tropical sun. The difference wasn't maintenance quality. The difference was design philosophy. The Browning was built for field conditions, for abuse, for environments where precision was a luxury you couldn't afford. The Hispano was built for controlled conditions that Darwin could never provide. The cannons were only half the problem. The Spitfire Mark V had an internal fuel capacity of 85 gallons. That gave it a combat radius of about 175 miles under optimal conditions. Combat conditions were never optimal. Understanding why this mattered requires understanding what a Darwin interception actually looked like. Not the heroic version, the real version. Japanese bombers flew from bases on Timor, over 400 miles away. Radar would pick them up approaching with maybe 30 minutes warning, sometimes less. Spitfires would scramble, pilots sprinting across the red dirt to their aircraft, ground crews still clearing the revetments. The climb to intercept altitude burned fuel hard. The Merlin engine was powerful, but power costs fuel. 20,000 feet, 25,000 feet. Every foot of altitude bought with avgas. Then the patrol. Circling over the Timor Sea, watching, waiting, scanning the empty sky for specks that might be enemy aircraft. More fuel gone with every minute. Then the engagement itself. Hard turns at combat power, maximum throttle, emergency boost when you needed every last horsepower to get behind that bomber before his gunner got a bead on you. The fuel gauges dropped visibly during combat maneuvering. Then the return. Damaged aircraft with compromised aerodynamics burning more fuel per mile. Exhausted pilot making navigation decisions over featureless ocean that all looked identical from 15,000 feet. Scrubland that offered no landmarks. Headwinds that couldn't be predicted until you were in them. Weather systems that forced detours. A pilot who got slightly lost. Who encountered unexpected headwinds, who spent an extra 5 minutes in combat, who took damage that increased drag. The math didn't forgive mistakes. Spitfire BR 528 lost June 1943 near Pine Creek, Northern Territory. Fuel exhaustion. The pilot made it almost back. Almost. The engine quit over the bush, miles from any strip, and he had nowhere to go but down. Another aircraft went into Darwin Harbour. Fuel exhaustion after combat. Not enemy fire, mathematics. The pilot survived, barely. The Spitfire didn't. These losses don't appear in combat statistics. They weren't heroic. No Japanese pilot got credited with a kill against a Spitfire that ran out of fuel, but they bled the wing just as surely as any enemy cannon. The records show it if you know how to read them. Operational losses, fuel exhaustion, mechanical failure, landing accidents on rough strips that the Spitfire's delicate undercarriage was never designed to handle. May 2nd, 1943. The biggest air battle over Australian soil. All 33 operational Spitfires scrambled against 40-plus Japanese aircraft. 25 minutes of desperate fighting over Darwin. Aircraft damaged, pilots wounded. Some didn't come back. But the combat losses tell only part of the story. Look at the operational losses column. The unglamorous deaths. Fuel exhaustion, mechanical failure, accidents. Every long patrol consumed airframe life, even when no shots were fired. Every difficult landing on a rough strip stressed components designed for English grass. Every day in tropical conditions degraded systems designed for English weather. We lost more Spitfires running out of fuel than in fights. The Spitfire wasn't just failing in combat. It was being ground down by an environment it was never built to survive. Now here's the question that confused people for years. The question 77 Squadron veterans knew the answer to. The question that makes no sense until you understand what fighting in the Pacific actually required. Why did the P-40 Kitty Hawk, the plane everyone called inferior, actually work better over Darwin? Look at the specifications side by side. The Spitfire is faster, climbs better, more maneuverable at altitude, better roll rate, superior in almost every metric that mattered over Britain, except the ones that mattered over Darwin. Squadron leader Dick Creswell had been defending Darwin with P-40s since 1942. 77 Squadron was formed specifically for this fight, the defence of Northern Australia against Japanese air raids. They'd faced enemy bombers with an aircraft nobody celebrated, an aircraft everyone agreed was inferior to the Spitfire in paper specifications. And they'd survived. More than survived. They'd developed tactics that worked, with equipment that functioned, in conditions that would eventually defeat the more famous aircraft. First reason the P-40 worked better: range. The P-40 could carry external fuel tanks, drop tanks that extended range meaningfully, that let pilots actually fly to where the enemy was, fight, and come home with reserves. The Spitfire Mark V's internal capacity was designed for 15-minute interceptions over southern England, where airfields were everywhere, where a pilot could glide home on fumes and land on manicured grass within minutes. Darwin wasn't southern England. The distances were oceanic. The next airfield might be 100 miles away across featureless scrub. Range wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Second reason: guns that worked. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, American weapons designed from the start for harsh conditions, for maintenance by crews who didn't have precision tools or climate-controlled workshops, for operation in environments where dust and humidity were facts of life, rather than engineering challenges to be avoided. The Brownings didn't care about humidity. They shrugged off dust that would have killed a Hispano. When the pilot pressed the trigger, they fired. Every time. Former P-40 pilot John Bailey said it directly. The Kitty Hawk was preferable to the Spitfire, one of the best planes he ever flew. That's not nationalism talking, not nostalgia for old iron. That's professional assessment from a man who flew both types in the conditions that actually mattered. The Hispano's theoretical hitting power meant nothing if the gun jammed half the time. The Browning's actual hitting power meant everything because it worked. Third reason: rugged design. The P-40 sat higher on its landing gear, less propeller strike risk on rough strips, and Darwin strips were rough. Packed dirt, red dust, occasional debris. Every landing was an adventure. The Spitfire's elegant, narrow undercarriage was designed for paved English airfields maintained by full ground crews with proper equipment. The P-40's systems were accessible for field repair. Mechanics could reach components without specialized tools. Its structure absorbed damage that would have crippled a Spitfire. It was designed from the start to operate from forward airfields with minimal support. Exactly what Darwin offered. The Spitfire was a thoroughbred, beautiful, fast, utterly unsuited to conditions outside its design parameters. The P-40 was a workhorse, less elegant, less celebrated in newspaper headlines, far more useful when the nearest proper maintenance facility was 1,000 miles away and the dust never stopped blowing. The transition from P-40s to Spitfires wasn't a military decision based on operational requirements. It was a political decision based on prestige, legend over logistics. Curtin wanted the propaganda value of Spitfires. Churchill wanted the alliance-cementing imagery of sending them. Nobody asked the pilots and ground crews who'd actually been fighting whether they wanted their reliable P-40 sex replaced with temperamental thoroughbreds. Clive Caldwell wasn't a man who complained easily. He'd earned his kills and his nickname through skill, aggression, and an absolute clarity about what worked in combat and what didn't. His reports went up the chain of command. Specific, concrete, documented with the precision of a man who understood that vague complaints get filed and forgotten. Cannon jamming wasn't bad luck. It was predictable and chronic, and getting pilots killed. Fuel limitations weren't pilot error. They were designed into an aircraft built for a different war on a different continent. Cooling system failures multiplied in tropical heat the Merlin engine had never been designed to handle. The constant speed unit, the mechanism that controlled propeller pitch, suffered repeated failures in conditions that stressed it beyond design parameters. All documented, all filed, all acknowledged in memos, all ignored in practice. The tension between Caldwell and higher command became constant friction. RAF doctrine had been developed over Britain against German opponents with German equipment at German ranges. That doctrine came to Australia with the Spitfires. It assumed conditions that didn't exist in the Pacific. It assumed ranges that Australian geography made impossible. It assumed maintenance facilities that Darwin couldn't provide. Caldwell pushed back. He advocated for changes. He documented failures. He fought the system while fighting the Japanese. And ultimately, he couldn't change the fundamental problem. The system preferred legend to reality. The Spitfire was famous. The Spitfire had saved Britain. The Spitfire couldn't possibly be wrong for Australia, and anyone who said otherwise was questioning the legend itself. Air Vice Marshal George Jones, Chief of Air Staff, would later acknowledge the problems. The official history eventually admitted what veterans had known from the start. But acknowledgement came too late for the pilots who died with jammed guns, for the ones who crashed with empty tanks in the scrub, for the ground crews who worked 18-hour days trying to make European equipment function in conditions it was never designed for. Here's what makes this story different from other war histories. It's not just what happened, it's what Australians were told, which was almost nothing. The suppression started during the war itself and used specific mechanisms. Censorship regulations gave the government power to control what newspapers printed. Every story about Darwin raids went through military censors who had explicit instructions to minimize. Casualty figures were falsified at the source. Official announcements simply stated numbers lower than the actual dead. Raid details were classified not for military security, but for civilian morale. The newspaper headlines of 1942 and 1943 told a story that bore little resemblance to reality. Enemy raid on Darwin, some casualties, when hundreds had died. RAF repels Japanese attack, when the defense had been overwhelmed. The public consumed a sanitized version of their own history and had no way to know the difference. But wartime necessity doesn't explain what came after. The war ended in 1945. Japanese invasion was no longer a threat. What possible reason could justify continued silence? The answers reveal something uncomfortable about how nations construct their own histories. Part of it was narrative convenience. Australia's war story emphasised certain battles: Kokoda, Tobruk, the Coral Sea. These were stories of Australian courage, Australian sacrifice, Australian success against impossible odds. They fit the national mythology of the digger, tough, resourceful, triumphant against adversity. Darwin didn't fit that narrative. This was a story of being attacked at home, of civilian casualties on Australian soil, of panic and confusion in the streets, of equipment that didn't work and allies who sent the wrong tools for political reasons rather than military ones, of a famous aircraft failing in ways that contradicted its legend. It was easier to forget. Easier to let the Darwin story fade into footnotes, while the comfortable narratives took centre stage in school textbooks and Anzac Day speeches. Veterans couldn't talk. Some because official restrictions lingered long after any legitimate security reason had expired. Paperwork signed, oaths taken, habits of silence formed. Some because the disconnect between their experience and public understanding was simply unbridgeable. How do you explain the Spitfire failed when everyone knows the Spitfire was the greatest fighter of the war? How do you describe watching guns jam repeatedly when the whole country celebrates the aircraft as a saviour? How do you make sense of your own experience when the official story says something completely different happened? So they stopped trying to explain. They shared fragments instead. At kitchen tables after dinner, in RSL clubs after a few drinks loosened the silence. Pieces of a puzzle they couldn't complete because the official picture had been deliberately scrambled. Their families inherited mysteries they couldn't solve, half-told stories that stopped mid-sentence, bitterness toward an aircraft they were supposed to worship. The most powerful evidence of what happened at Darwin doesn't come from official reports. It comes from family memory. Ground crew veterans speak of constant, exhausting effort. The refrain echoes across decades. Cleaned those bloody cannons until our hands were raw. Made no difference. They'd jam anyway. Armourers who cleaned the same weapon multiple times a day. Mechanics who struggled with cooling systems designed for English summers. Fitters who did everything right and watched their work fail anyway. Men who were blamed for problems that weren't their fault. Pilots knew their lives depended on equipment they couldn't trust. Press the trigger and nothing. Just nothing. And there's a bomber right there in your sights and your finger is jammed on the button and nothing happens. And the fuel, always the fuel. Watching that needle drop and knowing you've still got 50 miles to go. Doing math you don't want to do. These stories were told in fragments, gaps the veterans couldn't or wouldn't fill. The gaps speak to trauma, to experiences that violated everything they'd been taught to expect. The Spitfire was supposed to save them. Instead, it became another burden to carry. Systemic failure, political legend, suppressed history. The Spitfire that arrived in January 1943 was the wrong aircraft for the wrong war. Sent because Churchill wanted to demonstrate alliance solidarity and Curtin wanted the prestige of the legendary aircraft. Nobody in power asked the men who'd actually been fighting whether they wanted their reliable P-41s replaced. Fighting in conditions it was never designed to survive. Cannons that jammed in humidity that would have been unimaginable in England. Fuel tanks that emptied before missions were complete. Cooling systems overwhelmed by tropical heat. An undercarriage too delicate for rough strips. A legend that became a burden for men who knew the legend didn't apply to their war. They fought anyway. They maintained anyway. They died anyway. And when the war ended, their story was filed away. Not classified exactly, just not told. Replaced by narratives that served national pride over historical truth. But here's the thing. This history isn't actually lost. It lives in family memories across Australia. In the stories grandfathers told at kitchen tables. In the fragments that didn't make sense until you understood the context. In the RSL clubs, where old men who never got to explain anything finally said a few words to each other because they were the only ones who'd understand. Your family might have pieces of this puzzle too. If your grandfather or father served at Darwin, ground crew, pilot, any role, the comment section below isn't just for feedback. It's for collective memory. Tell the stories. The ones that never made it into official history. The contradictions that confused you as a kid. the fragments that didn't make sense until now. Together, we can tell the story that was hidden from us. Together, we can piece together what families experienced and what this nation was never allowed to know. This history belongs to the families who lived it. Time to recover it. Subscribe for more stories like this.